Welcome in, guys. With the release of Angular 15 and .NET 7, I figured it'd be pretty useful to go over how to create an Angular 15 frontend and hook it up to a .NET 7 API. And in that, we're going to include in the Angular frontend the new Angular Material 15 as well. So let's go over how to install or upgrade to Angular 15 and how we can create an application with these technologies. And then take full advantage of standalone components, what I think are the coolest feature to come out of this whole new Angular release. And then, like I said, connect that to a .NET 7 API. Let's go. And there should be a link to my GitHub in the description with all the code that I'm going to be using today. And quickly, if you end up finding this video helpful, please drop a like on this video so I can spread to more developers on YouTube. Thank you. So first things first, we're going to create a brand new Angular project. So before you actually create this project, just go ahead and make sure what version of Node you have. You might need to upgrade your Node version. And if so, go to the link that's going to appear on the screen. Go to that page and download the newest version of Node and you should be ready to go. But now let's create our project. Now you guys might be thinking, well, what project are we going to do? Well, in the spirit of the World Cup, I'm going to have an Angular material table. We're going to be showing a bunch of the countries that are participating in this World Cup with the confederation beside it that they are a part of. We're going to do add, edit, delete functionality, as well as the ability to click one of the rows in this table and show us a bit more information in another standalone component. Speaking of standalone components, we will be using only standalone components in this project since it's Angular 15 and it's a new feature, and I want to kind of show it off. So let's begin. Now that you have your project open, the first thing I recommend is checking what version of Angular you may have. Depending on what version you have, you might have to do a few more updates than just straight up updating to Angular 15. So there's a lot of documentation on the official Angular site on how to migrate your application, whether you're on 10, 11, 12, 13, whatever, to get to 15, no matter the complexity. It's pretty good. So those links will be in the description. But as you can see, I already have 15, but I'm still going to show you guys the command that you need to update or install, Angular 15. And the command to get to Angular 15 is going to be ng update at angular_core at 15 space at angular_CLI at 15. This will upgrade you to Angular 15. And if you need any other type of updates, usually you can just Google if it throws you a little error, but it's very straightforward as long as you have your node at the kind of level that it needs to be. And then you kind of run these Angular commands, you should be fine. And we also will be using Angular Material 15, and there's a few things you guys have to take into consideration when using Angular Material 15. It is that they've migrated a lot of the components into a new kind of form of them, if that's the best way I can put them. So kind of the old way of doing things has kind of moved to legacy, but they do have commands for migrating these if you already are trying to just upgrade an old project to Angular Material 15 and you already had Angular Material components. There is a command for that, and I'm going to put it right here. It is ng generate at Angular Material :mdc migration. There's a lot of documentation on how to do this migration properly, and I'm going to link that in the description as well, because once you run this command, it's going to basically ask you what components do you want to upgrade: buttons, lists, tables, whatever you want to do. And it's kind of good to do it module by module and do it slowly, and if it can't automatically update it, it will leave a comment of to do. But links to how to do that will be in the description. But in our case, we are just going to be adding Angular Material since we don't have it in this project. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the app.component.html, and I'm just going to delete all this default code that's here because I don't want anything here. We're only going to be using standalone components. I'm not going to go to the traditional way of doing this. I just want the router element here so that we can route to our standalone components later. Now I want to actually start getting Angular Material in here. So let's create our module that we're going to need for this. So in here, I want to do ng generate m material. Let's create that. Create our new module in here. Now that we have our material module created, let's add in all the Angular Material stuff that we might be using. So as you guys can see, I added in a lot of the common Angular Material stuff that I use, and now they're here and we're exporting them out. And now our standalone components just have to import this module and they have access to everything that they're going to need. The next thing I want to do is create a folder for my models, and I will show you guys kind of the structure of the data that we're going to be working with. So I created this new folder models, and in here I'm going to paste my two models that I'm going to have. So I have two models here. This model is called country. So in each country object, there's going to be a team ID, a country name, a confederation ID, and then there's going to be an object of confederation. this models what we're going to have in our API and our database, and looking at the configuration object is just configuration ID and configuration name. It's just a foreign key that points to this object, and those are the models that we will be using for this project. The next thing that we need to go ahead and create is I want to go ahead and create my main standalone component for my main page. And to do that, we're going to do ng generate component, and we're going to call it main page. And then you have to put the dash dash standalone. So at Angular knows that we're doing a standalone component and not a traditional component. As you can see, we have now created our component, and if you want to make sure that it is a standalone component, which means that we do not have to go into the app.module to declare it and export it, we just check here and it says standalone true. That means it's cool. So now what I was mentioning before is you now have to go here, material module, and now this component has access to everything in Angular material, and we are good to go within this component and Angular material. Now that I have my main page created, I'm going to go to the app router, and I'm going to add the path because we want this as our default page. So we go to our routes, and we're going to set it here. So we're going to have our main page component, and that's how we're going to set. This will be the default page that opens. And right now we don't have any HTML, but now let's go set the HTML. And this will break because we're not going to have anything, but I want to add in all the HTML for our main page, and then I'm going to explain it. So replacing the main page component HTML here, we're going to have what we're going to have here. I'm just going to have a div with a header of World Cup teams. We're going to have a primary button with a method of add country, which we'll do later. Then we're going to have this big Angular material table, which inside of it is going to contain a column that is country name, a column that is a confederation name, and then at the end of the row, there's going to be 3 different actions. So the clicked row is what I mentioned at the beginning, which will lead us to another standalone component and will show the information from the row in a nice little card. The second one is going to be the edit country. When we click this, it's going to open us a material dialog, and it's basically going to give us the ability to edit whatever's there, and then we can, submit it, and then it will refresh the table with whatever's been changed. And then this last one is going to be the delete one. Obviously, it's going to open up a dialog, be like, hey, you sure you want to delete? If so, let's delete it and then refresh the table as well. And then this just basically is the displayed columns and the definitions for the rows. But that is going to be the HTML for this main page. But now let's go to our main page.ts and set up everything that we're going to need over here, including our data source and all of our methods and all of that good stuff. Now that we're back in our main page.ts, let's start adding things in. The first things first, we're going to need this constant for country data. We're going to get our country model inside of here. We are going to need that because that is going to be setting our data source in a second. I'm now going to import 3 things here. This is going to be the list of columns that we're going to have. Like I mentioned, the country name, confederation name, and actions. So that's going to be these 3 right here. Country name, confederation name, and actions. You need those so that the Angular material table knows what columns to show. And if not, it won't show things. It'll be an error. This is where the country data, this is where we're going to have the data that we pull from the API. And this is going to be the data source set to this table as it is right here. Going back, then we're going to have this flag basically. So when we have that material dialog for creating or editing, we can just reuse that without having to make 2 different components. Next thing, I'm going to import our constructor. Our constructor will have a team service, which we will create in a second, as well as this activated route that we need to bring in our router. Import as well, Angular router. And then we're going to have material dialog, which will need a slight import. And this will be for that material dialog that we're going to use for the add, editing, and deleting. Next up, once this page loads, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to want to load our main table with all its data from the database. So how to do that? I'm going to be reusing this method, getAllTeams, whenever we kind of do an action and then have to come back and refresh the table. So I want to make this its own method so we don't have to copy and paste that code everywhere. And on load of this component, we are going to getAllTeams. The next method that we're going to have is the clicked rows. And that's going to be the one that shows a card on another component with the information. So that basically is going to be showing how we can do lazy loading through routing to another standalone component and then go hit that endpoint once we actually need it, and not once this whole application loads, we already kind of preload that information. No, once we navigate to the other standalone component, we will then pull that data, and that's going to be kind of on a get by ID basis, but that's what we're going to be showing off in there by navigating to this other component, which we will create in a second, and passing along that team ID of that information of that given country. But that is what method goes here, and that is what we just created here. The next method we're going to have is our add country, or the method that will be clicked to create a new country, and that will be this button up here. We will be reusing the same create country component, which we will create in a while, for editing as well. But what we're going to have in here is we're going to create a material dialog, which is basically essentially a pop-up, and it's just nice to use than having to create another component and then kind of do the overlaying. With CSS, that kind of annoys me, so I'd rather do this Angular material kind of pop-up or dialog. I find it very convenient, and it's very easy to pass information along, as well as you have these nice events from when you close that dialog, and then you can do different things. As you can see right here, we basically open and we give it a component to pass in. Then we gave it our data that we want to pass along. So it's basically going to be, since we are creating a country, we don't already have information. It's not like edit, where in edit we will pass actual information in here. On add, we don't have anything. So we're just going to give it basically an empty object. And then we're going to say, is this edit? No, it's false. So we don't need that yet. And then here, this is going to be after the dialog closes. We subscribe to the event that it closes, and then we take whatever that dialog passes back to us. And then, since I expect that object passed back to be what country we want to create or add to the database, I then go to our service, which we haven't created yet, and then to our add country or create a country method, pass that data in, subscribe, and then once that has gone to the API, created it, we then want to come back and again refresh our table. So it has what's going to happen whenever we go to actually create a country and click this button up here. Next up is going to be a very similar method. This is going to be the edit country. So we are going to be passing in a row of country as well. These are all being passed in right here, the whole row. So when we click the edit, so it's like a little create icon, we're going to click that, pass in the row. So all the object, because we're going to want to, manipulate that object. We're going to, again, go to that same reusable create country component that we used up here. But now the isEdit is going to be true, so that we know that we need to pass in an actual row object, because this needs to get binded to the drop-down list of the confederations that we have in our application, as well as the country name needs to be passed in because the user could edit it. And then again, we are using the material dialog, and after it closes, we do something similar, except instead of calling our add country method in our service, which, like I said, we will create in a second, I'm passing it in to the edit country. And then again, once it's gone to the API and edited whatever entry it is, we're then going to refresh the table. And the final button click kind of method that we're going to have here is going to be the delete country, which again is going to be this one right here with the material icon delete. And what's going to happen there is we are going to get the team ID from whatever country that it may be. We are then going to use a delete country component. So this will be a separate component, but the only thing we're really going to be doing in here, it's basically going to be are you sure you want to delete? So not really data kind of going back and forth as much as, hey, do they confirm and say, yes, they want to do it, or no, they don't want to actually do it. It was a mistake. And let's just kind of close the dialog and let's not actually do anything. So we will also create this standalone component for those reasons. But if it closes and it comes back, hey, they do want to delete it, then we're going to call a delete country method in our service, pass in the team ID, and then it's going to go to the API, delete whatever it is, and then refresh our table. And now you guys have seen that we've been reusing this method everywhere. So now it's time to actually define what this method actually does. So whenever we call getAllTeams, that method will call the getAllTeams method in our service, and then basically subscribe and set our data source with whatever updated values we have. And once we've done that, these are all the methods that we're going to have. As you can go back in here, we have the add country, clicked row, edit country, and delete country. And that is the code for all of those, clicked row here. Our add country, we're going to be creating a new country. Our edit, we're going to be editing an already existing entry. And then deleting, we pass in an ID and basically delete it if the user says, yes, we want to delete it, or no, we're not going to delete anything. And then our reusable getAllTeams, which basically will go to the API and refresh our table. Now that I've created my main page component, I want to start creating all these other components that this page and application needs to work. I'm going to start with the individual country component, which we are going to need to route to. So we're going to have to create this and add it to the router as well. So I'm going to open main page in the terminal, and we're going to do ng, G for generate, C for component, and we're going to do individual country component, and we're going to do standalone again flag and create it. Now that I've created the component, I want to make sure that it is standalone, and you can see here it is. And now I want to actually add it to the app routing module so that we have it so we can do this navigation right here. So this is actually going to be the path for this component. We're going to use the individual country component, but we're actually going to take advantage of lazy loading. Basically, we are only going to load this component in and go fetch its data once we actually navigate to it or need it. If not, Angular is going to be lazy about it and not actually go and grab the information or load it. And it just makes the application faster because we only grab things and go get it when we actually need it. So that's what we're setting up here. We're basically saying that the individual country component, which we say then here, and we are saying we're going to pass an index. That index is going to be the team ID that we're passing along, and then load it, as you can see, an object specifying a lazy loaded component. And then we're going to import, essentially, this is the path of the component, and then we're actually going to navigate to it. So once we actually do this navigation, this will work. And with us setting this up now, what I want to do is go set up everything that we're going to need inside this individual country component to actually, go take the team ID, go to a service, and then with that service, go retrieve the information for that country and then show it. So let's set all that up. That will also include creating our services. So let's open this in the terminal, ng generate service, and we're going to call it team. So it's going to be our team service that will get placed right down here at the bottom. Now we have our team service, so let's actually add in all of our endpoints. But first, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to import this team service because it exists now, and that error can also go away. That can stop bothering me before I forget. And now let's actually add in all our methods that we're going to be using for our team service. So first thing in our service is that we're going to need to add a path to our API. That is going to come from our environment file. Regardless of whether it's production or development, we're going to need this API URL here. So go to your environment file and add in right here API URL right here, and that's where you're going to be pulling that from. Then in our constructor, we're going to need to add HTTP client. HTTP client will need to be put in the app.module. So we will need to go there and import the HTTP client module. So going back to app.module. In app.module, we're going to grab the HTTP client and put it here. Do our import. And now that we're going to have it there, we're good. We can forget about that for now. Now back here, we're going to go with the first method. The first method that we're going to have is our get team method in this service. That is basically going to be the get by a given ID. So that's going to be the one that we actually use here. Whenever we do this, we are actually going to be calling that one on load of the individual country component. That's what we're going to be calling here because we want to get just a single get team by ID. That is the endpoint that we're going to be using. And let's get all our imports in here. Get our model. Add in HTTP headers so that we can set that we're going to be, expect that we're sending JSON and getting JSON. And then that is going to be our method. We're basically just going to say HTTP client.get. We're expecting a country object. And then we are just saying get team by ID and passing in that index that we are passing in on this given route right here. And now the next method that we're going to have is going to be our get all teams. This is going to be the method that gets called every time that we run this get all teams method down here. So that's what's going to be called here. That basically just, again, is similar headers. And then we're just going to call get teams, and that's going to return just a list of countries. The next method in this service is going to be the add country, or this is the one that basically posts or creates a new country. We're going to receive a country object. Again, similar headers. We're going to stringify the country object and send it to the add team method in the team controller. Next up is going to be a tiny method, the delete country. We again pass in the country ID, send that ID through to the delete method, and then we just delete. And that's what's going to be called whenever you do this delete country right here. And then finally, the last method is going to be the edit country. This is going to be the one that again also receives that edited country. We're going to then go in, pass that object in, and call the edit team endpoint. And it's going to be a put. And these are all the methods that we're going to need in this service. So now let's go to the individual country component, the one we're going to route to whenever we navigate to show a single country that we click on in our table. Let's go set this component up with everything it's going to need to, one, go and retrieve that, given team or country, and then display that card with the information in it. So now I'm back at the individual country component. As you can see right here, we just have this basic thing. So I'm going to import our Angular material card that we're actually going to use to show the team's information. I'm going to copy that in. As you can see, there's a squiggly line on the card, and you can say, oh, but didn't I already import Angular material into the main page component? Why isn't it working? Well, it's because they are standalone components. They are independent of each other. So because you import it here and it's like in the file structure, doesn't mean that it's actually being used there. You actually need to go in here and then import it in as well so that all those errors go away, because you have to use it and import on kind of a case-by-case scenario. So now, as you can see, the squiggly lines here have gone away. And all we're going to have here is a material card with the width is just going to fit the content. Then we're going to have card content, which is basically the country you selected or clicked is this one. And it's just going to show the country name and the confederation name of the country. And we're going to have a button that basically just says go back to the main page, because all we're doing here is we're clicking on that little arrow. We're going to go to this component, show information, and then all we want to do is really show. We don't want to actually do any actions there. So we just have a button that sends us back to the main page. So now let's actually set up what's actually going to happen in this individual component. Inside of here, the first thing that we're going to have is just an object. This object is just the default object that we're going to have. So we need to just import our models here. That's going to be just for a basis for when this component loads, we have something there so we don't have any errors. Next, we're going to have our constructor. This constructor will import its service. Again, the activated route. This is all for routing purposes. Bring that in here. Now, on load of this component, we are going to have to do one thing. We are going to have to go to the route, the snapshot parameter, and get the index. This index, well, why does it look like this? Why do we need this? Well, that's the index that comes from here whenever you route to this page from here. It's this team ID. That's what we have to go grab. And we grab it by doing this. And then since it gets passed in as a string, I want to convert it to a number because this method expects the index to be a number before we can then go call this endpoint and get the country object by ID in our API. So going back, that is what's going to happen here. And then we're going to take that country object and set it to this team object. And then once we get that, this binds correctly to the Angular material card. Now let's set up this go back to the main page method. And it's going to be a tiny method that all it does is basically just navigates us back to the home page. And that's all that's going to happen. And once you navigate to the home page, obviously it's going to reset the component and then get all teams and refresh, and we're all good to go. So now that we have our service set up and the individual country and that whole standalone component and this navigation and the lazy loading and all that is set up properly, now let's create and get rid of these squiggly lines here. So let's create the component that will also add but also edit. So let's go ahead and create that as well inside of here. So we're going to do ng generate component, and it's going to be the create country standalone component. As we can see, we have the component here. I can check here, make sure that it is again a standalone component. This one will also need material, but this one differently will also need the reactive forms module, since we will be using forms to obviously capture the values for either creating a country or editing one. So we do need to bring in both of those imports. So this is really the only thing that you do need to keep kind of track of when using standalone components, is that whatever you need in a given component, you will have to import. So this create country component will be used twofold, because why would you want to create and edit using two different components when you can just reuse them very easily by just keeping track of a few key kind of things. So the first two things I'm going to create is a country object. Let's bring it in our model. This is basically going to be what we use to kind of bind to things. This is edit is kind of our flag that, if you guys were paying attention, is the one that we're using in here. This is basically just keep track of what button was clicked. Was the create country button clicked, because then we handle things a little differently, or was it the edit one where we actually pass in data? So that is kind of our little flag to trigger the different uses of this given component. And then we are going to have this country form, which will be a form with 2 form controls. These form controls will hold the country name and the form control for what is selected in the dropdown. And you may say, well, what dropdown? I haven't seen the dropdown. That's because we haven't added in our HTML. So let's go back and do that. I'm going to copy this in. And now, again, we don't have any errors here. Why? Because we already brought in Angular material. So we don't have the errors that we did whenever we had the kind of material card. What we have here is basically just a div with display flex. We have a form group of country form, which I think we just created here. Yes. And then we're going to have a ng on submit. Once we are actually submitting our form, we're going to be showing the country name in a form field and another form field that is a drop down right here that will loop. We are not going to go pull the list of confederations. I didn't want to do that. So we're just going to have the hard coded list in this component. And I'm going to do that in a second. We're going to loop through that, and that's going to be in this drop down. And then we're going to have another button that this is the actual submit. So as you can see, when you have a form submit button, you just have to do a button and then do type submit, and it just knows in the form that it's going to call this ng submit on submit method, which we'll create in a second. And then I have another button, and this one's basically just going to be, oh, we actually don't want to edit or create. We just want to close the Angular material dialog again. So to do that, I just have this method right here, which we'll create in a second. So going back to our TypeScript file, we are now going to add that list that's going to go into dropdown. This one will be the value that eventually gets put in here. Let's import our model. Now let's go to our constructor. Our constructor will have the form builder for creating the form. Import that. We are going to be injecting mat dialog data. This is why, and this is what. Well, that is going to be because whenever we open this Angular material dialog, we are sending data across and sending it back. So that's why we need to have this inject so that we can, 1, capture the data. This data object is the object coming in from here when we pass it in from one component to the other component using Angular material dialog, and then we can inject that dialog data. And then this is going to be, again, the reference to the component that we have currently. And then right here, what we're going to do is we're going to pull the data row. Data row is going to come from here. It's going to be what we're passing through right here. And that's how we capture the data sent through here. And then again, we're going to capture that flag in this is edit. So again, country object is this one up here. Is edit is here. These 2 values, I repeat, come from right here in the Angular material dialog. This is how you pass them through. You can also have different types of configurations and set for how big it is and different other settings that you can set. And that would just be also set before you do this. But just wanted to mention that as well. Now, once we have our constructor, let's actually set up what happens on init. On init in this component, what we're going to have is basically we are going to set up our form. So is this an edit? Is it an edit? If so, we actually want to pre-fill our form out. Instead of having it empty values, we want it to have the values that we pass in and capture in this country object from the data.row, which is the values coming from the main component. In that, we just set our form. So now, once our drop down and our kind of, dialog fully opens, it's going to have already these, filled in values, and then you can edit them. But if it's not an edit, then we want to have a clean form so that the person can select something from the drop down from scratch, and then also type in a country name from scratch. The next method that we're going to have is our onSubmit method. That submit method will just check, hey, is the country form valid? If it is, let's get the values from both form controls that we have. We're going to just reuse this object that we already had from the data.row that we got from the main page component, and then we're going to close the dialog. This will close the dialog and then pass along all the data that we had. So that then, whether it's right here after close or right here after close, we now act accordingly with the data that the user either created and wants to create or wants to be edited. And now we have that onSubmit method, and that's the one that's going to be right here. Now the last thing that we have to do is set this cancel method, and that is going to be, again, very simple. This is just going to be this .dialog ref.close null. And all that's going to do is basically just close the thing. And if we send null through, I'm just checking here, essentially, in add country or in edit country, is it not null? Is it not null? If it is null, then we don't want to actually go in here because we're not going to actually have the correct data, or we just don't want to manipulate anything. So just skip it. But if it is an actual object, that means that we actually hit this right here, and then we actually want to act on it. And now going back to the main page component, we want to just import that component so we have that reference. So now we only have one squiggly line, and that is the delete country component, which we are going to create right now. Going back to this integrated terminal, we're just going to create another terminal because I just love having a billion terminals open. ng generate component delete country standalone, and now we are creating this component. Now I want to go ahead and set up the HTML and all the methods in my .ts file. So the HTML for this delete country component is going to be as follows. We are basically going to have a paragraph tag that's just going to say, you sure you want to delete? And then we're going to have one method that says delete, and it's going to be a button, and then another button that says cancel, and that's just going to close. Now being back in our delete country component, we need to import our Angular material module. So let's bring that one in, so we can have our two buttons that we are using right here. And now going back here, we're going to need our constructor. Our constructor needs that reference to the Angular material, dialog that we are using so that we can close it. And then we're going to have just two methods, and I'm just going to copy them both in at the same time. We're going to have a delete method and a close method. Both of these will either just close, but passing in a true or false. As you guys remember, right here, we basically said, do we actually want to delete? If true, then we actually want to go ahead. If false, then we're not going to do anything. We just wanted to close it. So that is all the code that we were going to have right here. Now let's go and bring our reference here. And we have that set up. So now we should have, I believe, all the code set up for this Angular 15 project. But this is all the code that we're going to need for our Angular 15 front end. So now let's actually ng-serve after an npm install to make sure that our code and our project is running fine and everything looks good. Obviously, there's not going to be any data because we don't have the API set up. But once we have that, we want to make sure that first everything looks good, and then our data will populate as follows. So I ran an ng-serve and our project opened. There's no errors. Everything looks good. Our table obviously has no data, so our actions are also hidden. But from what we can see, our Angular material is working just fine. If we click here, we can see our create country component, which is this one right here with the drop down and this other form field. So everything looks good. Obviously, there's no values there, but we do have values in the drop down. This all looks good. So our application, our front end, seems fine. So now let's move on to the API, the .NET 7 API portion of this video. Now that we're done with the Angular 15 front end portion, we are now at kind of the .NET 7 API chunk. But since I really wanted to focus in this video on the Angular 15 side, on Angular material, the only thing I really wanted to do with the API is show that connection, how you actually connect these two kind of projects. So I'm not going to go in and break down all the code in the methods, the database I'm using. But lucky for you guys, I already have a full video where I explain how to create this project and all the new updates with Entity Framework 7, and I go over all the tables and the database, all the methods, and I go step by step just like I did on this project, but for that API. So if you guys want to get that full kind of scope on this API project, there should be a card up here at the top so that you can actually get the breakdown of this. But right now, I really only want to focus on the connection between these two projects, as well as the one change that you do need to make so that these two projects can talk to each other. So before I make the one change, I do want to run this API and show you guys the endpoints. But if you've been following along, you've seen all the endpoints because we've already done them. So it's going to be the get teams. This is going to be the get all teams. We're going to have a get method, which gets them by ID. We're going to have the add team, which is the create a team, our edit team, and our delete team. And if you guys, have seen our front end, we had our create, we then have our delete, and our create that's going to be reused for create and edit. And then on our main page, we have our get all teams, as well as this one that gets the individual team by a given ID. So those are the endpoints that we have, and this is our API. And like I said, if you guys want the full breakdown of this video, it is my .NET 7 API video, where you will get the whole scoop on this whole project, as well as updates and really cool updates to Entity Framework 7 and how this whole project was scaffolded and used with our SQL database. But now to the one change that you do need to make in this .NET 7 API that I did not cover in that video because it wasn't interacting with an Angular project, and that is that you do have to make sure to set a CORS policy. This CORS policy is very needed if you want Angular to actually talk successfully with a .NET 7 API and you don't get a CORS error. You have to set a CORS policy here. Let's say you were in production and now you needed to allow some other URL, some other, place to access this. Well, you would just add in or change this URL so that you give access to whatever site that may be. And then you have to make sure to add app.useCORS right here. But that is all the changes that you need to make from that video to here. Is just add this CORS policy. Everything else from that other video works just fine here. So please go check out that video, drop a like on there, and then pause this video and then come back after you watch that and have this whole project set up. So now let's actually test that this whole thing works together. So with our API running, I'm just going to close this down. Our project over here is also still running. So now let's go back here. Let me refresh this. Now that I refresh this, you can see that our data is all coming through. So we have France, Brazil, Mexico, Germany, Japan, Ghana, USA, Spain, Qatar, and England, all with their correct confederations here. We can see that this is still working fine. We can see that if we load this here, we are actually correctly getting this. For some reason, in my database, they have a bunch of spaces. But as you can see, I clicked this one and it worked. If I click Mexico, it also loads the URL correctly, but again, there's for some reason all this space. I don't know why it is. Someone let me know in the comment section why there's a bunch of space. I don't know, and I couldn't fix it. Well, let's cancel this. So we have all this here, and now let's actually test out kind of that navigation. So this navigation is going to be this one, where we click load the component, go to our database, and get this. So in my API, I should have breakpoints for all of these. I'm not going to do for the get all teams, but for this get team by ID, I will set a breakpoint so we can kind of hit these methods. Going back to our front end. So now that we're here, let's actually start testing out that all this works as it should. So first things first, I want to do let's navigate. Let's navigate to one of these components. So that navigation is going to be this router.navigate to the individual country component. And inside of that component, what is going to happen? If you guys remember, once we do the lazy loading and this loads, we're going to then get the index from the route and we're going to open up the country in the HTML. We're going to have just a card that just says the country name and the confederation name. So once we actually go back here, we're going to click France. France is the first thing in my database. So we're going to click this. We have a team ID of 1. Let us continue. And we are able to open up that individual component. And it says that the country selected is France and they're part of UEFA. And then this go back is the one that was just going to route back to the main page right here. So if we click that, we should just go right back to this page. So cool. The navigation works as it should. Let's get rid of this debugger right here, this breakpoint. We are again able to load Brazil. Let's go Ghana. Ghana is able to also be here. So we're good with that. That arrow works and that whole navigation with the lazy loading works great. Now let's actually create a country. So this opened. So now what we have here, we had that form with the drop down and this. So now let's create a new country. So let's do Serbia. It's part of UEFA. So now let's submit. Boom, we're at the add team, so the create team. So we went through the service, everything worked. We're here. We can see that we have this new team. So 2 and Serbia. 2 is the confederation ID of UEFA. And then we have Serbia here. So what we're going to do now is just step through, create. We see in our repository that we also have everything correct. We're going to create the new object and then add it. And we're going to save. And what happens on save is that you guys remember on save, once it comes back from here on submit, we're going to go back here and then on submit, we go and add the country in. And then once everything finishes in the API, we get all teams. And if we go back to our project, we can see that Serbia was successfully added here. So now let's edit it. Obviously we go back to edit again. I don't know why it saves with so many spaces. Someone please let me know. So now we have Poland. So let us submit Poland. If we go back to our edit team, you can see that we still have our team ID of 15, which was the ID of Serbia when it was created. Our confederation is still UEFA, so that's 2, still correct, and Poland. So now we step through. We are now in our edit team method. peep the new Entity Framework 7 way of editing. For those of you that may have not watched the video, you should go watch the video. And right here, we are just setting the property of the country name that we are updating. So step all the way through. Back to our project, we can see that Poland successfully took the place of Serbia now. And all that worked, and as again, you guys remember, once it finishes editing, it reloads this table. And now let's delete it because I don't want Poland in this table. So again, we open it and you can see, are you sure you want to delete? That is from that delete component that we had right here. And now let's click that we do want to delete. Click delete. We are now here. We see team ID 15. That is the one that is now Poland. Step through. And once we step through, we can see that it is now deleted from our table. So boom, we have a fully working Angular 15 application front end connected to a .NET 7 API, and it is working now. And I showed you guys how to, create a country, edit something, delete something, and also route and get by an ID, as well as just loading all the data. And that is how you create that Angular 15 application and connect it to a .NET 7 API and get it working. So you may think now, what's the next step? Well, you might want to host this application in Azure. And if so, you might want to check out this video that shows you how to do it.